August 1956. The Eastern Mediterranean is calm, almost indifferent, as a convoy of British and French ships slips through warm night air. On paper, they are moving to protect a vital international waterway. In private, senior officials already know the truth is far more uncomfortable. This operation, carefully planned, tightly coordinated, and deliberately obscured, will not restore imperial authority. It will expose its limits. Within weeks, two of Europe's most powerful nations will discover that the Middle East they once dominated no longer belongs to them, and oil, the resource they believed would secure their future, will quietly accelerate their decline. To understand how Britain and France lost their grip on the Middle East, we have to rewind several decades back to the moment oil transformed the region from a distant imperial concern into a strategic obsession. Before the First World War, Middle Eastern territories mattered mainly for geography and prestige. After oil, they mattered for survival. Modern navies, air forces, factories, and economies ran on petroleum, controlled energy, and controlled power itself. Britain understood this earlier than most. In 1914, Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, made the controversial decision to convert the Royal Navy from coal to oil. It made Britain faster and more modern, but it also made the empire dependent on fuel it did not fully control. That dependency pulled Britain deep into Persia, Mesopotamia, and the Persian Gulf. By the end of World War I, British influence stretched from Iran to Iraq, reinforced by mandates, military bases, and oil concessions that overwhelmingly favored London. France followed a parallel path. Though less dominant in oil production, Paris saw Middle Eastern influence as essential to remaining a great power. French control over Syria and Lebanon after World War I was not only about culture or security. It was about maintaining access, leverage, and relevance in a world increasingly shaped by energy. At first, this system appeared stable. Western oil companies extracted Middle Eastern crude. Local rulers received royalties. European governments enjoyed steady supplies. But beneath the surface, the arrangement was fragile. Oil wealth flowed outward, while political control remained foreign. Nationalist movements across the region noticed the imbalance and resented it. By the 1942nd, that resentment had hardened. The Second World War devastated Europe, but left the United States and the Soviet Union as dominant powers. Britain and France emerged victorious yet exhausted, economically weakened, and increasingly dependent on American support. The Middle East, meanwhile, was no longer a passive arena. Leaders there understood oil's leverage and began demanding a new deal. Nowhere was this clearer than in Iran. In 1951, Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, arguing correctly that Iran received only a fraction of the profits from its own resources. For Britain, the move was a shock. The loss threatened government revenues, energy security, and imperial prestige. London responded with sanctions, legal challenges, and diplomatic pressure. When those failed, Britain quietly sought help from Washington. The 1953 overthrow of Mossadegh, orchestrated with American intelligence support, temporarily restored Western control over Iranian oil, but it came at a cost. The coup radicalized Iranian politics, damaged Western credibility, and demonstrated that force and covert action, not consent, were now the tools holding the system together. France faced its own reckoning slightly to the west. In Algeria, oil discoveries in the Sahara intensified an already brutal colonial war. Algeria was not officially a colony, it was legally part of France itself. Losing it was unthinkable. Yet oil revenues could not compensate for the political and human cost of maintaining control. The more France fought to hold on, the more legitimacy it lost, both internationally and at home. Still, neither Britain nor France believed their position was truly collapsing. They assumed oil made them indispensable. They believed the world, especially the United States, would ultimately back them to preserve stability. That assumption would prove fatally wrong. The first clear warning came from Egypt. In 1956, President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Officially, it was about sovereignty and development. Unofficially, it struck at the artery of European power. The canal carried much of the oil flowing from the Middle East to Europe. For Britain and France, losing control was not just an economic threat, it was symbolic. Suez represented their continued relevance as global powers. What followed was a secret plan. Britain and France, coordinating with Israel, prepared a military intervention to seize the canal and remove Nasser. They believed speed and force would present the world with a fait accompli. They believed oil transit was too important for anyone to stop them. They miscalculated. The invasion went ahead, but the political response was immediate and devastating. The United States, fearing escalation and determined to assert its own authority, refused to support the operation. The Soviet Union issued blunt threats. Global markets panicked. Oil supplies tightened overnight. Instead of strengthening European control, the crisis exposed how vulnerable Britain and France had become. This was the first major turning point. Oil had not protected their influence, it had revealed their dependence. And from this moment on, the unraveling would only accelerate. The Suez invasion collapsed faster than anyone in London or Paris expected. Militarily, British and French forces performed efficiently. Politically, they were isolated. Within days, the United States applied crushing financial pressure, threatening to sell British bonds and block emergency loans. Britain's currency wavered. Oil shipments stalled. Faced with economic disaster, Prime Minister Anthony Eden ordered a withdrawal. France followed, furious and humiliated. The lesson was unmistakable. Britain and France no longer controlled the rules of power in the Middle East. Oil had shifted the balance, but not in their favor. From this point forward, every major decision they made in the region would be constrained by forces they could not command. American financial dominance, rising Arab nationalism, and the growing weaponization of energy itself. In the aftermath of Suez, Middle Eastern leaders understood something crucial. Oil was not just a commodity. It was leverage, and Europe needed it far more than the producers needed Europe. Egypt emerged politically stronger. Nasser became a symbol of defiance against old empires. Across the Arab world, his message resonated. Control your resources, and you control your destiny. For Britain and France, this new reality was deeply unsettling. Their oil companies still operated across the region, but their ability to dictate terms was eroding rapidly. Behind closed doors, Western oil executives and government officials scrambled to adapt. Concessions were renegotiated. Profit-sharing agreements improved marginally for host nations. But these reforms were defensive, not visionary. They were designed to slow decline, not reverse it. Meanwhile, the United States moved decisively into the vacuum. American companies expanded their presence in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and beyond. Washington framed its involvement as stabilizing and anti-communist, but the economic logic was clear. Oil access would underpin American global leadership. Europe, by contrast, would increasingly depend on both Middle Eastern producers and American protection to keep energy flowing. France responded with stubborn resistance. In Algeria, oil discoveries hardened Paris's resolve to stay. French leaders believed Saharan petroleum could secure energy independence and preserve great power status. But the war consumed enormous resources and political capital. Every barrel extracted was offset by mounting casualties, international condemnation, and domestic unrest. Oil did not save French Algeria. It prolonged the conflict and deepened the trauma. Britain's retreat was quieter, but no less consequential. London shifted from imperial control to strategic partnership, maintaining bases and influence where possible. Yet oil policy increasingly slipped out of British hands. The creation of new national oil companies across the Middle East meant that negotiations now involved sovereign governments, not compliant monarchs backed by British arms. By the early 1962, another transformation was underway. Middle Eastern producers began coordinating. In 1960, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela formed the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. Its creation was not dramatic at first. Western governments largely dismissed it. But the idea behind it was revolutionary. Collective control over supply and pricing. This coordination further weakened European leverage. Britain and France could no longer play producers against one another as easily. Decisions made in distant capitals now directly affected European economies. Oil, once the foundation of imperial control, was becoming a tool others could wield. The consequences extended beyond economics. Political alignment shifted. Middle Eastern states pursued non-alignment or balanced relations between East and West. Arms deals, infrastructure projects, and diplomatic influence followed oil revenues. Britain and France found themselves negotiating as secondary powers, often reacting rather than shaping outcomes. Perhaps most damaging was the loss of credibility. Suez had shown that European threats carried limited weight without American backing. Attempts to intervene quietly to influence leadership changes, to pressure governments through companies became riskier and less effective. Each failure reinforced the same conclusion. The age of unilateral European action in the Middle East was over. Yet policymakers in London and Paris struggled to accept this. They still believed oil dependency made the region too important to abandon. So they stayed involved militarily, diplomatically, commercially, but without the authority they once wielded. It was an uneasy presence, marked by compromise and constraint. By the late 1960s, the system was under visible strain. European economies were growing, energy demand was rising, and alternatives to Middle Eastern oil were limited. At the same time, producing nations were growing more confident, more organized, and more willing to assert control. Oil had not destroyed Britain and France overnight. It had done something subtler and more enduring. It had shifted power away from them, step by step, until their influence depended on the consent of others. The next crisis would make that dependence impossible to ignore. And when it came, the cost would be paid far beyond the Middle East. The breaking point arrived not with troops or treaties, but with a decision taken quietly in oil ministries thousands of miles away. By the early 1972s, Britain and France were no longer imperial powers in the Middle East, but they were still deeply exposed. Their economies ran on imported oil. Their industries, transport systems, and post-war welfare states depended on cheap, uninterrupted energy. What had changed was control. Pricing power, production levels, and political leverage now rested increasingly with the producers themselves. In October 1973, that reality became impossible to ignore. War erupted between Israel and a coalition of Arab states led by Egypt and Syria. As fighting intensified, Arab oil producers faced a choice. For decades, oil and politics had been officially separated. This time, they were deliberately fused. Key OPEC members announced production cuts and imposed an embargo on countries seen as supporting Israel, including Britain and France, despite their attempts at neutrality. The impact was immediate and severe. Oil prices quadrupled within months. Fuel shortages spread across Europe. Factories slowed or shut down. Inflation surged. Governments imposed emergency measures, reduced speed limits, rationing plans, and even car-free Sundays. For ordinary citizens, the crisis was a shock. For policymakers, it was a revelation. This was not simply an energy crisis. It was a transfer of power. Britain and France had assumed that oil dependence was manageable, that markets, alliances, or diplomacy would cushion any disruption. Instead, they discovered how little leverage they actually possessed. They could not compel producers. They could not substitute supplies quickly. And they could not act independently of the United States, which now positioned itself as the central negotiator between oil states and consumers. The deeper damage was strategic. Middle Eastern governments had proven that oil could be used as a political weapon and that Europe was especially vulnerable. Even after the embargo eased, the balance never returned to its old form. Prices remained high, contracts shifted, national oil companies consolidated control over reserves once dominated by European firms. France attempted to adapt by pursuing closer ties with producing nations, offering arms sales, nuclear cooperation, and diplomatic support in exchange for energy security. Britain focused on North Sea oil, hoping domestic production would restore autonomy. Both strategies helped, but neither reversed the broader trend. The true cost of oil dependence was now clear. It limited foreign policy. It constrained military options. It forced compromises that would have been unthinkable in the imperial era. In retrospect, the most damaging mistake was not losing control of oil fields or pipelines. It was the belief that oil could preserve empire in a world that had already moved on. Britain and France had invested enormous political and moral capital defending a system designed for extraction, not partnership. When that system collapsed, it took their regional authority with it. Meanwhile, new beneficiaries emerged. Middle Eastern states used oil revenues to modernize, to assert independence, and to shape regional politics on their own terms. The United States entrenched itself as the primary external power, guaranteeing security for producers while anchoring the global oil trade to the dollar. Europe, once dominant, became structurally dependent, economically exposed, but politically constrained. None of this was inevitable. Alternative paths existed: earlier revenue sharing, genuine political autonomy, or coordinated energy transitions. But those choices were postponed, resisted, or dismissed as unrealistic. Oil profits were too tempting. Control seemed too valuable to relinquish. By the end of the 1,970 seconds, the outcome was unmistakable. Britain and France still mattered diplomatically. Their companies still operated globally. But in the Middle East, the region they once carved into spheres of influence, their power had fundamentally collapsed. Oil had not betrayed them. It had simply revealed a truth they had refused to face. And that truth would shape global politics for decades to come. By the early 1,980 seconds, the quiet destruction was complete. Britain and France still spoke the language of global influence, but the Middle East no longer responded to it. Decisions about oil production, pricing, alliances were now made in Riyadh, Tehran, Baghdad, and Kuwait City, not London or Paris. European governments could negotiate, persuade, and adapt. What they could no longer do was decide. The long-term consequences reached far beyond energy markets. For Britain, the loss reshaped its entire global posture. North Sea oil softened the economic blow and briefly restored confidence, but it could not replace Middle Eastern leverage. British foreign policy narrowed, increasingly aligned with American priorities. The era of independent intervention ended at Suez. Oil dependence merely confirmed it. Britain became a secondary power in a system it once dominated, influential in finance and diplomacy, but no longer decisive in strategic regions. France's reckoning was more turbulent. The collapse of its Middle Eastern authority fed directly into a broader crisis of identity. The Algerian War ended in 1962, leaving deep scars in French politics and society. Oil revenues from the Sahara never compensated for the cost of repression, division, and eventual withdrawal. In response, France pursued strategic autonomy, building its own nuclear deterrent and cultivating selective partnerships, but its Middle Eastern influence was transactional, not commanding. What united both countries was a permanent loss of insulation. Energy shocks now rippled instantly through European economies. Political crises in the Middle East translated into inflation, unemployment, and social unrest at home. Oil had fused distant instability to domestic consequence. Meanwhile, the region itself was transformed. Oil wealth allowed Middle Eastern states to accelerate development, project power, and challenge Western dominance on their own terms. Some invested in infrastructure and education. Others poured resources into militarization and regional rivalry. The outcomes varied, but the shift was undeniable. Control over oil meant control over national destiny. At the global level, a new system solidified. The United States became the primary guarantor of Middle Eastern security, not out of imperial nostalgia, but because global energy stability underpinned its own economic order. The dollar replaced European currencies as the backbone of oil trade. Financial power followed energy flows. Britain and France adapted to this system, but they did not design it. Looking back, the destruction was never loud. There was no single treaty, no final defeat, no dramatic handover of power. Instead, oil eroded influence quietly, decision by decision. Every intervention justified as temporary. Every compromise framed as pragmatic. Every warning dismissed as manageable. The tragedy for Britain and France was not that they lost oil. It was that they misunderstood what oil had become. They treated it as a resource to be controlled, not a force that reshapes political order. They assumed access guaranteed authority. In reality, dependence reversed the relationship. The more essential oil became, the more power shifted to those who owned it. History rarely ends with collapse. More often, it ends with adjustment. Britain and France adjusted. They survived. They remain influential nations with global reach. But in the Middle East, the age of European command ended not with independence movements alone, nor with military defeat, but with the slow realization that energy had rewritten the rules. Oil did not explode their empires. It drained them quietly, persistently, and irreversibly. And in that silence, a new Middle East and a new world order was born.